The world needs more people with curious minds. People who aren't afraid to admit when they don't know something. We need to take the time to encourage more lifelong learners. At least that's my goal with this podcast. I think the future is at stake. But at the same time, I do believe that a more informed population can and will move humanity forward. All we have to do is keep learning. What's going on, everybody? I'm glad to be back. I'm super excited about this episode. I feel like I say that all the time, because I just I have a bunch of fun doing this podcast, to be honest with you. But this episode really is an awesome one. I'm very excited about it. Um, I have to admit, this is the fastest that I have ever went from learning about something new to starting writing the notes for the show. This was the quickest I've ever went from that first step of learning something to starting to write the notes. So I'm really excited to be able to share this one with you guys. Now, I'll start off by saying, if you have never seen a water bear, please do yourself a favor. And as long as you are not driving right now, I want to emphasize that. If you are driving, just wait until you get to your destination. But if you're not, please go to Google, type water bear into the search bar, and go ahead and click images. And you are going to see an image of something that basically looks like a caterpillar mixed with a gummy bear. That's what you're going to see. And that is an image that I would like you to have with you as we carry on through this episode, because I think you're going to learn some things about these animals that I learned about them that are going to blow your mind in the same way that they blew my mind. And it's more fun when you have the picture of what these things look like in your head. So if you're driving right now, if you're unable to use Google right now, just picture a gummy bear and a caterpillar mixed. That's the best way to look at it. Um, and yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. I now welcome you to the world of water bears. So the Science Channel TikTok account had a video of a water bear on their account, maybe like a couple weeks ago that I saw, and I immediately started googling them and working on the notes for this episode, like immediately. Now, I had seen some photos of them before, but I didn't know what they were. I saw them as like the thumbnail on a YouTube channel, and I remember thinking the picture was really unique, but I didn't look up what it was, and I saw them again on this video, and I realized, okay, this is what they are. They are also known, other than water bears, as moss piglets, but the scientific name for them is tardigrades. That's spelled Tardigrades. Tardigrades. But honestly, the scientific name for me is Nicholas, and I do not go by that at all. So we are going to call these guys water bears for this episode because, I mean, come on. Like, it's fantastic. So we're going to call them water bears. Now, I want to create a little bit more of a baseline before we really get into some of the more fun details about these guys. So let me just give you a little bit more information on them. Water bears, by definition, are a phylum of 8-legged, segmented micro animals. And the thing that I want you to take from that definition is the word micro animals. You see, water bears are between a half a millimeter and 1.5 millimeters long, which places them in this category of micro animals because they can't be seen with the naked eye. They're only visible through a microscope. However, the big difference between micro animals and microorganisms is microorganisms are unicellular, so they're single-celled organisms. A micro animal, like a water bear, is an actual animal. It's multicellular, like all other animals. So basically, the way to think about them is they are a ridiculously tiny animal. They're really, really, really small, but they are an animal. They're not a single-celled petri dish like bacteria that you would see in like a science class or something. These are an actual animal. They're just a tiny, tiny little microscopic animal. Now, there are over 1,000 species of water bears, and they exist everywhere. They exist all over the entire planet. You can find them in the deep sea, you can find them inside mud volcanoes. They exist on every continent, including Antarctica. And while you can find them at the North Pole, you can also find them in your backyard. They quite literally are everywhere on this planet. Now, if you think that fact that they're a global species and they're on every continent is cool, and it is. Wait until I tell you what makes these animals special. Because what really truly makes them special is they are quite possibly the most resilient animals on the entire planet. According to a paper that was published in Frontiers in Microbiology, it's a biology journal, or a microbiology journal rather. Water bears have been found to survive extreme conditions such as exposure to extreme temperatures, exposure to extreme pressures, both high and low, air deprivation, radiation, dehydration, and starvation. Now, that's not to mention that they've also survived in outer space. Think about what I just said. They have lived in the vacuum of space, which by far already outside of dogs makes them my favorite animal. It's literally dogs, them, and then every other animal fucking sucks after that. Like, these things are able to survive in space. They're already shooting to the top of the list for me. Now, let's take a second to really dive into what I mean when I say some of these extreme conditions, because I think it's going to help illustrate my explanation of why I think they're so interesting when you can really picture the scale of the extreme conditions that I'm talking about, because it is wild. When I mention extreme temperatures, for example, they can survive in 1 degree Kelvin, which I've heard Kelvin before, but I actually was able to learn for this episode. So apparently Kelvin, I guess it measures things that are cold, because 1 degree Kelvin is negative 458 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is a temperature where gases turn into liquids. So that by itself to start is insane, because what I'm saying to you is you can't freeze them and kill them. That's not a possibility. I'm talking about negative 458 degrees here. Like, that's not that's in a lab. You would have to make that. Like, these things cannot be frozen. So that's all. First of all, now, they can also, like I said, they can withstand extreme pressures. So they can tolerate pressure 6 times higher than the deepest point in the ocean. And if you'll remember, we did an episode on the deepest point in the ocean, the Challenger Deep. If you haven't seen it, it's on the all podcast platforms and YouTube as well. But basically, no human could even remotely survive down there. It's not possible. Sorry, I had to get a drink there. Yeah, so it's not possible. You couldn't survive down there. You need to be in a special pressurized submarine. There's only a few people that have ever been there to that depth before because of the pressure. And these animals can tolerate pressure that is 6 times higher than that. Now, when I mentioned radiation, water bears can survive hundreds of times more radiation than humans can survive. And some of these numbers, like that one, are ridiculous to comprehend. Like, that's a crazy number. Like, hundreds of levels of radiation is one of those numbers that when I was reading it, to be honest, you read it and you just sort of move on. You don't really take the time to think about how crazy that is. I think that same thing happens in the economy sometimes. Like, people will throw around like billions and trillions of dollars, and you don't really even think about like what that actually means. I feel like that's the same thing here. So to kind of give you an example, think about how preposterous it would be if I asked you, how many donuts can you eat in 10 minutes? If you had to. How many donuts could you eat in 10 minutes? And you gave me a number. Let's say it was 10. You were like, I think I could eat one donut every minute for 10 minutes. I think I could absolutely do that. I can handle that. Maybe it's 20. It doesn't really matter what the number is. The point that I'm making is imagine you told me whatever that number was for you, and then I pointed to a guy in the corner of the room. I went, yeah, it's cool that you could eat that many. Do you see that guy over there? He can eat hundreds of more donuts in that same 10 minutes than you can. Like it's not even you can't even wrap your head around it. Like it would literally seem impossible. And yet these water bears are able to survive radiation levels hundreds of times larger than what we can. And I just think like you have to take sometimes statistics like that and put them in a context where you can really see how absurd they are, because that one right there is probably the most insane to me. Um Also dehydration. They and see, look, I put my foot in my mouth right there because I this might be the most insane one, honestly, because they can live without water for a decade. They can literally live for up to a decade without water. It's 10 years. You can you can literally not give them any water for 9 years, and then all of a sudden give them a little bit of water, and they will be immediately fine, good to go. 9 years after the last time they had water. Now, when it comes to space, they are able to survive in space 10 days in space. They're able to survive 10 days in space. And I'll be honest with you, I wish I'd looked into that a little more, because I think what that means is they ran an experiment where they took them into space for 10 days and then brought them back and they were still alive. So that's not saying the limit that they can live in space is 10 days. That's just saying that we've proven they can live in space for 10 days. They could definitely live in space for longer than that. Also, let's go back to the extreme temperatures for a second. They can also survive 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And honestly, that's the least impressive one of all of these to me, because while I will admit it's a crazy number. I mean, it's 3 times more than we can survive basically. I mean, 300 degrees is crazy. It's also less than blueberry muffins can survive. So I do think that one impressed me the least. Of the extreme conditions that they're able to stay alive in. But I actually did find out that heat is where they're most vulnerable. But at the same time, it's like as long as the earth doesn't melt, they're not really going to find themselves in those settings. And I did see some research that talked about how they are able to survive in extreme heat for short periods of time. It's just when you start to go a little bit longer, you start to go a couple hours, a couple days, they do struggle with the extreme heat. But overall, this is by far the most durable animal I've ever heard of in my life. I mean, it's insane. Like these and once again, imagine what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an animal that looks like a caterpillar gummy bear, and it's a millimeter long, and it's able to survive all of this. All of what I'm talking about. You can drop a nuclear bomb on this thing and it's able to live. It's amazing. And while I was researching this, I kept coming back to a single question. And that single question was, how are they able to survive these conditions? I understand that they can, and honestly, once I found out that they don't need water for 10 years, it's kind of like, all right, so fundamentally they can survive anything. But how? How are they doing this? And to answer the question of how, we actually can for a few of the extreme conditions, but for other ones we can't. So for the ones that we can answer, for example, in regards to dehydration, I turned to a Wired.com article that was written by Matt Simon. And it says, quote, the water bear's trick is something called cryptobiosis, in which it brings its metabolic processes nearly to a halt. In this state, it can dehydrate to 3% of its normal water content in what's called desiccation. Yeah, desiccation. Okay, desiccation, becoming a husk of its former self. But just add water, and the tardigrade roars back to life. Now, also from that same article, they have another explanation from Bob Goldstein of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he offers another explanation as to one way that they could be staying alive. So he says, quote, there's one that we know of, which is some animals that survive drying make a sugar called uh, trehalose. And trehalose sort of replaces water as they dry down. So it'll make a glossy surface, or sorry, a glassy surface actually, and where normally water would be sitting. That probably helps prevent a lot of the damage that normally occurs when you dry something down or when you rehydrate it. Not all of the 1,000 or so species of water bears produce this sugar, though, he says. So there must be some other trick going on because all the species can survive and they don't all do this. So it it's just that right there. It's the fact that a professor from the University of North Carolina, who is by all accounts here, he's just, yeah, I mean, he's a microbiologist. He's a doctor of microbiology. And he is unable to explain why these thousands of species of water bears are able to survive in all of these different conditions. And the fact that we can't explain definitively how water bears survive these conditions, I think that's something to really think about. Science really cannot explain this. But there is some good news, though, too. Scientists are actively trying to understand how the water bears are able to be so resilient for a bunch of great reasons. And I'll turn here to Thomas Boothby from TED Ed. Like, if you ever see on YouTube, like TED Talks, their education platform. So he said that scientists are trying to understand how water bears stabilize their biological molecules under extreme conditions because they believe that we may be able to apply that knowledge to help us stabilize vaccines or develop stress tolerant crops to cope with climate change, which I think is super cool. Like the fact that we might be able to use the information that we gain from these animals to help protect humanity from the effects of climate change on our food sources and potentially more, to be honest with you, viruses and bacteria that could potentially and probably more than likely will affect our day-to-day life. The fact that we could use information that we gain from studying these micro animals to protect us from some of that stuff is really, really cool. He goes on to say they might also give us clues as to the environmental limits of biological life and how to protect astronauts, in addition to helping us answer the question of whether or not life can be supported on planets less hospitable than our own. I mean, come on, when has that been more relevant than right now? We have a rover on Mars right now. Elon Musk is talking about wanting to colonize Mars right now. So once again, this could be wildly helpful to understand that question of how are they able to do this. But, I go back to the point that I made earlier, which is they don't know the answer to that yet, though. And I want to take a second to turn back to Bob Goldstein of UNC to really drive home how incredible the durability of these animals really is. Quote, they are probably the most extreme survivors that we know of among animals, said biologist Bob Goldstein of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. People talk about cockroaches surviving anything. I think long after the cockroaches would be killed, we'd still have dried water bears that could be rehydrated and be alive. And remember, like right there, where he says animals, these things are actually animals. Like, once again, remember, these are not single-celled microscopic organisms. According to science, these are actually animals. They legitimately have a brain. That's right. They have a brain. Now, it's not a complex brain. It's not a complicated brain. And to be honest, I have a feeling that we don't know much about how it works. But they do have a brain because they are really, 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 really tiny animals. It's incredible. So there it is. We have single-handedly found an animal that realistically could outlive humans in some catastrophe. And I really think that's crazy to consider. Because let's take a second to think about the fact that it's entirely possible that a meteor strike or a nuclear war or global flooding due to climate change could someday exterminate the entire human population of the planet. And yet, if that happened, water bears would still be alive. They would survive it. They would be all that's left, essentially. Like even like Dr. Goldstein said, like even in that circumstance, like they would outlive cockroaches. And it's interesting to me because they are both at the exact same time potentially the animal that outlives us during a catastrophe. And yet, simultaneously, they're also the only animal that might be able to help us figure out how to survive that very same catastrophe. So, now that we've kind of looked at water bears as a whole, as thoroughly as we can, I think, I would like to end with the final mind blowing aspect of our story. These animals were first discovered in the year 1773. That's right. We have known about water bears for 248 years. And essentially, we have had the same questions about them the entire time. So it makes me wonder why it's been so challenging to fully understand them. I mean, we've known about them since before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So it seems like we've had plenty of time to understand them, and we still can't answer the questions of how they're doing what they're doing. We can't answer the question of what is the purpose of their durability? Like why are they so durable? What is the reason for that? And there's a bunch of other questions that we haven't been able to answer in almost 250 years about these animals. And so for fun, I would like to offer you a hypothesis as to why we might not be able to understand them ever. Not only in the last 250 years, because we haven't fully understood them in that time, but we may never be able to. And before I go into it, let me just say, remember, this is just my hypothesis. I have no idea what I'm talking about. I mean, I seriously do not take this theory for me as anything other than the ramblings of a guy on YouTube who suffers from heartburn and failed his driver's test on the first attempt. Like this is just a guy telling you what I think could be a possibility. But still, hear me out. What if the bears originally came here from outer space? I mean, the vacuum of space doesn't kill them, right? So we already know that. And we don't understand how they're able to do what they do. And we also don't understand why they're nearly indestructible in the first place. Everything about them seems legitimately alien. What if they found themselves in a situation where something displaced them throughout the cosmos in the same way that a gentle breeze displaces dandelion seeds all over a field? The dandelion's not in control of that. However, they become displaced in almost a random way. There's no rhyme or reason for it. They just go as the wind goes. And what if that happened to the water bears? And as they were floating through space, they eventually got to Earth and they landed here, just like those dandelions land in any random part of the field that they just happen to land in. And what if the water bears just started adapting and creating more water bears when they were here? Just like those seeds just start adapting and creating more dandelions when they land in that field. I mean, you have to admit it would explain why water bears are so challenging for scientists to understand. And it also breeds the question, if that's the case, and they were from space, what's their purpose here? Is it entirely random like the dandelions? Or is it possible that it's something else? We don't have anything else like them here on Earth. And so some sort of extraterrestrial explanation does seem to make a little bit of sense. And honestly, alien or not, that's the question I would like the answer to. What is their purpose for being so indestructible? And if you still aren't sure about that theory, that's okay. If I didn't grab your attention there and you don't think, man, that makes a lot of sense, Nick, that's totally fine. But what I will ask you to do before you entirely dismiss it, seriously, go to Google, type water bears into the search, hit images, and take a look at some of the 3D renderings of them. You'll know the difference between like the microscope pictures and then the 3D renderings. Look at some of the 3D renderings and tell me that those animals don't look like one of the most alien things you have ever seen in your entire life. I'm telling you, it's absolutely worth the time to go Google it. I am telling you. You will be very, very happy that you did. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, everybody. Remember, you can check out the podcast on YouTube if you're interested. The channel's up and running. Just go ahead and type Nick Learns Everything into the search bar, and you're good to go. Shout out to all my family and friends. You guys are the best. And yeah, thanks everybody who's listening. I hope you like this episode. I'll see you guys next time. In the meantime, adopt more dogs and keep learning new things.